Hello, my name is Stephen Mintz. Together with Kate Castaneda of the Department of Anthropology, we are going to introduce you over the next 14 sessions to an entirely new and fresh approach to the study of the Western Hemisphere. We, in our course, The Americas, Identity, Culture, and Power, are going to look at every aspect of life in the Americas over the past 500 years. Indeed, in today's class, we're even going to go before this period and look at the world before 1492 so that you can understand the lives of the peoples not only of the Americas, but also the peoples who lived in Europe and Africa who would help to create an entirely new American society. If we could have the screen display, please. This course, The Americas, Identity, Culture, and Power, is part of an entirely new program at the University of Houston, the American Cultures Program. This course is the introductory course in that new program, which is also part of a larger Center for the Americas. We at the University of Houston are committed to making Houston a key player in the new globally integrated world of the 21st century, a world that cuts across national borders and therefore requires a new education that is appropriate for a new world. Our goal in this class is to give you an entirely new kind of education, a new way of looking at history, a new way of looking at culture, a new way of looking at your own society. First of all, the course will be truly interdisciplinary. Over the next few weeks, you will encounter some of the most exciting and innovative lecturers at the University of Houston who will come from virtually every program and discipline in the humanities and social sciences, from literature, from history, from sociology, from anthropology, from communications, and elsewhere. Thank you. Among the people that you will encounter are some of the University of Houston's foremost scholars, people like Lois Zamora, who's Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts, who is one of the country's leading specialists on the comparative literature of the Americas. Dorothy Baker, who's a specialist in United States literature and also the literature of America's Native American peoples. Richard Blackett, the new John and Rebecca Moore's Chair of African American Studies and History, who's a specialist in the Caribbean and anti-slavery movements. Howard Pollack, one of the country's leading specialists in the history of music. Susan Kellogg, a specialist in the history of the indigenous peoples of Mexico. Cynthia Freeland, an associate dean who's also a specialist in American philosophy. Joe Katarba, sociology, a leading authority on popular culture. And Garth Jowett of the communications program, who is one of the country's leading experts on film history and the study of mass culture. So the education you're going to receive in this class is truly interdisciplinary. We are going to cut across traditional departmental boundaries to give you a more complete, a more thorough understanding of Americas, its peoples and cultures than we think you've ever had before. The education that you receive in this class and in the new American Cultures program is also going to be multicultural. Perhaps if you walk into the Yale Club in New York City, the country looks pretty homogeneous. But if you venture into any University of Houston classroom, you quickly see that this world is increasingly diverse. It's increasingly multicultural. In the past 5 years alone, the University of Houston student body has shifted from 15% minority students to 45% minority students. This is a sea change, but it also represents a change that is occurring in other parts of American society at the same time. Today, in the country as a whole, over a third of all students in elementary and secondary schools are minority students. And in California, we're talking about approximately 50% of the students in public schools. In other words, the future of the United States is a diverse future, and our education increasingly needs to reflect that. Further, our future is going to be more international than the world is today. The education we hope to offer in this class, and indeed in our American Cultures program, will be hemispheric. Texas exists on a border region connecting the United States and Latin America, and we aim to take advantage of that border. If Texas is going to prosper in the 21st century, it will not be by standing alone or even by standing wholly aligned with the United States. It will survive and prosper by taking advantage of its position at the very center of the Americas. Our future is, in short, NAFTA's future, and we will see how Houston deals with that. Further, this course and the new American Cultures program will offer you an education that is critical, that is self-critical, and what I would call self-reflexive. What I mean by critical is not negative. That is, this isn't going to be anti-American studies. We're not going to be bad-mouthing anyone. By critical, what I mean is analytic. The point of an education is to be able to ask tough questions fairly but analytically. And that's precisely what we're going to do in this course and in our program as a whole. What do I mean by that? For one thing, we are going to deal very intensively with issues of race, of gender, of ethnicity, of social class, and religion in this class. We may speak of the American people or even the peoples of the Americas, but as we all know in our everyday lives, these people are riven by many deep social and ideological divisions. We in this course will be paying attention to the unity, to the shared experiences of these people. But we will also spend special effort looking at the divisions. In short, we're going to ask a question in this course is, what is it precisely that people hold in common, and precisely what is it that disunites them as well? Further, in this class, we're going to deal with many subjects that people talk about outside of universities, but sometimes don't discuss inside universities. Issues of ethnic and racial and regional stereotyping, of prejudice, of discrimination, issues of economic underdevelopment and imperial dominance, and further, the way the cultural images shape our culture, identity, and psyche. Each individual carries in her or his own head certain images of what the United States is like, or what Mexico is like, or what the Caribbean is like. We're going to see how those images were created, and then we're going to look at them quite critically, scrutinizing them, analyzing them, and trying to understand what they truly mean. If I could have the next screen, please. Now, let me say a few introductory remarks before I throw myself ahead. It is remarkable how many Americans hate history. A recent Gallup poll took a look at students and asked them to rank 22 different disciplines. And what was remarkable about this survey is that history came in dead last. Other studies have discovered that students get lower grades in history courses than in any other subject. Now, no one in their right mind would believe that history is more difficult than, say, organic chemistry or calculus. And so it's not that history is harder, and that's why people score less. Rather, it seems to be that many students are turned off by history. If they were to summarize why they're turned off by history, they could sum it up in a single word. Either history is boring or history is irrelevant. But we know it doesn't need to be that way. More people go to see historical museums every year than go to all Major League Baseball games and football games combined. People are now even willing to pay money to watch a History Channel. And if you think of some of the most popular films that appear each year, many of them draw on history for their subject matter. So if people hate history, it's because they hate academic history. It's not because they hate history in general. People deeply understand that history is fundamentally the roots of their personal identity, their collective identity, their place in the world. People intuitively understand that the present world is a product of forces that date back into the past. But somehow, academic history often leaves that out. Not this class. Kate Seal, Castaneda, and I believe that history does not need to be boring, that history does not need to be irrelevant, because history deals with fundamental questions. The issues that we will be addressing in this course, issues of colonialism, of conquest, of imperialism, both economic or cultural, of revolution, of racial conflict. These issues are not abstractions. These are issues that we continue to confront in our everyday lives. So why do people hate history? Perhaps it's because of those heavy, weighty history tomes that people carry, those which average about 4.5 pounds and 900 pages in length. But I think the deeper reason is because of the way history is taught. A way that tends to exclude real conflict, a way that excludes true drama of the past and replaces it with what I would call melodrama. By melodrama, I simply mean placing simplistic conflicts between right and wrong, good or evil, with the real deeper conflicts that we all confront in our own personal lives. In short, what history often does when it's taught in schools is it's designed to teach what used to be called citizenship. That is, respect for public officials, understanding of the institutions that make up our society. It's not used for the real underlying purpose of history, which is to illuminate the present by understanding the past. The deep meaning of history is to uncover the forces and processes that are transforming our lives day by day, decade by decade, century by century, and that's precisely what we're going to do in this course. Now, this class and the American Cultures program as a whole are designed around several themes. And before I throw myself into the substance of our class, let me give you a sense of the themes that will be unifying this course and the program that it's a part of. Theme number 1. America does not simply mean the United States. The United States is not simply America. Rather, America is a complex region of interrelated cultures, of interrelated groups of peoples and nations. America is plural. America is not simply singular. Las Americas, the Americas, that is what we need to study, not simply one single part of the Americas. So one of the key points of this course and our new American Cultures program is to, as I would put it, deconstruct the concept of America as we use it every day and replace it with a new, more pluralistic and inclusive notion of Americas that includes all the peoples and cultures of the Western Hemisphere. In short, what this course and what this program seeks to do is to foster closer relations and increased understanding among all the peoples of the Americas, irrespective of their place of origin. We're going to talk about an Americas that doesn't simply go from sea to shining sea, but rather an Americas that goes from pole to pole, from the tip of Argentina to the top of Canada. If we are truly going to be prepared for the multicultural, increasingly international world of the 20th century, 21st century, then that needs to be our subject matter. Our second theme is that the Americas are a region with a shared history, but a history that has had profoundly different outcomes. All the peoples of the Americas underwent experiences with colonialism. All the peoples of the Americas underwent experiences with conquest. All the peoples of the Americas from Canada all the way to Argentina had experience with slavery. And yet, out of that shared collective experience, very different societies emerged. So one of the points of this course is to try to explain why that is. Why is the United States different from Mexico? Why is Canada different from Brazil? And how are they different? In other words, we're going to be using comparisons, cross-cultural analysis to get us to understand that things are not inevitable, that things didn't have to turn out the way they did, but rather could have moved in quite different directions. I've long believed that the best way to learn about myself is to compare myself to my sisters. In other words, to try to see how it is that three people who came from the same family could end up so differently. And the best way to learn about the United States, I'm convinced, is to compare us to other societies that have undergone very similar experiences. In other words, our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. As I said, each society in the Western Hemisphere experienced colonialism, slavery, revolutions for national independence, mass migration, ethnic conflict, the suppression of indigenous peoples, and the like. But today, the societies of the Western Hemisphere occupy very different places in the world economy. They have very different political systems. They have very different social structures. And they have very different attitudes towards race. How this emerged, why this emerged, is one of the questions we will be asking in this course. Why, for example, in the United States, do we view race in terms of black and white, when in Brazil they have a multi-shaded racial system that divides people into an intricate number of gradations based on racial intermixture? And why in Mexico, in contrast, do they have a notion of a cosmic race that was created out of the blendings of many people? 3 countries, 3 fundamentally different approaches to the issue of race. Nothing helps more to understand cultural difference than cultural comparison. So, a fundamental goal of this course and the New American Cultures program is to explain why a shared historical background resulted in fundamental cultural, economic, and political differences. Theme number 3. The Americas are not simply a geographic region. The Americas are not simply the Western Hemisphere. The Americas are a process. A historical process in which groups intermixed and came into conflict and produced wholly new cultures. So in my view, the Americas, in the sense that I wish to use it, was created in 1492. That is, it depended on the collision of African, European, and indigenous American cultures to create an entirely new synthesis. More mixture, more hybridization, as they would say today, and more conflict has taken place in this hemisphere than anywhere else in the world. And it's a product of that intermixture. It's a product of that cultural blending and conflict that a truly unique set of cultures emerged. So if you want to know why it's better to live in the Americas than it is to live in the Old World, it's precisely because in the New World you had diverse cultures that were truly the product of global integration. We're sometimes told that a new world is being created today as national boundaries break down. But to anyone who's lived in the Americas for the past 500 years, none of this is new, because for 5 centuries, the cultures of the Americas have been creating entirely new cultures as a result of cultural contact and blending. Okay. So, since 1492, more peoples from more diverse places have intersected in the Americas than any other part of the world. And the result has been, first and foremost, to create new hybrid cultures. Cultures that are a complex mixture of African, Asian, Europe, and America itself. Chop suey does not exist in China, and I defy you to go to Italy to find a pizza with cheese in its crust. In America, new kinds of foods and new kinds of cultures emerged. In Germany, you may have Frankfurters, but they're nothing like American hot dogs. And Switzerland never produced American processed cheese. In other words, out of cultural mixture and blending emerged new hybrid cultures, not just in food, but in religion and politics and many other aspects of culture. Tex-Mex cuisine might be the perfect example of the kinds of cultural blendings that have taken place. The chicken fried steak is a sort of bastardized version of Wiener Schnitzel that came to Texas through Pennsylvania originally and finally made its way here. In other words, our food, our lifeways are truly the product of cultural blendings. Equally important, this process of cultural contact, cultural conflict, created entirely new groups of people. African Americans in the United States, Afro-Brazilians in Brazil, Afro-Caribbeans in the West Indies, Hispanics, Latin Americans, Native Americans. None of these groups existed before contact. They are a product of the New World in important ways, and they each created a culture in response to the pressures of the New World. So one of the key themes of our class is precisely how this process of cultural definition, of boundary setting, has taken place over the past 500 years. Americanization has not made us all homogeneous. If anything, the process of Americanization has made it all the more crucial to set up ethnic, racial, ideological, political, and religious boundaries so that people can define the distinctiveness of their own identities. It's this dual process of hybridization and differentiation that is one of the dominant themes of New World history over the past 500 years. Just to give you one example, the emergence of the concept of a white people. During the 1700s, no one spoke of white people. There's an incredibly disturbing essay by Benjamin Franklin, an essay on population that would later be the inspiration for Thomas Malthus's theories of population, in which Benjamin Franklin asked Britain to get rid of the swarthy Swedes and Dutch and Germans who he claimed were polluting Pennsylvania. I guess Franklin must have had very light-colored skin indeed if he wanted to get rid of the swarthy Swedes. Yet clearly, by the early 20th century, a notion of white people emerged. And sometimes that definition could be incredibly arbitrary. Under American U.S. immigration laws in the early 20th century, Armenians were classified as Asiatics and were therefore barred from the country. During the massacres of the early 20th century, however, the United States changed the definition and made Armenians whites. It's a very peculiar definition of terms that can be changed by act of Congress. Now, this new notion of a white identity clearly served certain purposes. It undercut class resentments among ethnic whites. It helped legitimate the removal of Native Americans in order to provide opportunity for whites. And in particular, it helped to maintain the institution of slavery because it unified all whites, regardless of their ethnic or class background, against all blacks, who, of course, also came from diverse ethnic and geographical regions. So one theme of our class is the way certain concepts that we take for granted gradually emerged. One of the points of a college education, I'm convinced, is to force or encourage students to see that those bedrock beliefs that you take as matter of fact often are more complicated than you think or are actually false. There is no idea that most human beings take more for granted than they know who they are and what the world looks like. And yet, when biologists study human beings, they've been unable to locate that self any place in the brain, and they understand that the way we see the world is all a product of the way our sense organs take it in. In other words, that one belief that all people feel more than any other, that they know who they are, is actually a fiction. It's a creation of their own brains. And if you can't take that for granted, there is nothing one can take for granted. The fourth theme of our course is that the diverse experiences of the peoples of the Americas have created distinctive psychologies and outlooks which are evident in art, in literature, in music, in social thoughts, and even in social movements. The art of the United States is quite different than the art of Mexico or Brazil. The music of the United States is quite different than the music of the Caribbean, even though, of course, Caribbean music has had enormous influence on the United States, disco being its most recent embodiment. Now, I don't want to imply that there is such a thing as national character, that is, that all people in a society share the same set of attitudes, beliefs, outlooks, and the like. We all know that that certainly is not the case, that instead what one has is tremendous diversity within societies. Yet, even in saying that, we all know that there are certain ideologies and psychological outlooks that are broadly shared. That half of Americans do see the Super Bowl, or that many Americans have seen the same forms of movies. In other words, there are ideologies and outlooks that are broadly shared and that are strongly reinforced by the instruments of mass communication, by movies, by television, by radio, by popular music. In the United States, there is a distinctive ideology, even though we often seem to imply that ideologies are only held by our adversaries. Some of the characteristics of that ideology, I would submit to you, are a belief in success, a commitment to technological innovation, a belief that our society is fundamentally different than any other society in the world. And that outlook is very much a product of our history, a history in which, except for the South, the United States did not lose any wars until Vietnam, a history that has been marked by continuous improvements in standards of living, with the exception of the Great Depression and more recent days. In other words, history has an impact on the way we think about the world. History has an impact on our own personal psychology. And that history has given us a fundamentally different outlook than any other people on the face of the earth. Our optimism, our faith in progress, our conviction that in the end, America will always triumph, our belief that God is on our side, our belief that we are the new chosen people, replacing Israel of old, all of that is a product of our history. But, of course, history can be dysfunctional. It can be counterproductive when times change. Americans have always found it very difficult to deal with failure. When people fail, we tend to blame it on personal flaws, or perhaps on their race, or perhaps on conspiracies, or else we simply deny it. Many people who've felt their standards of living stagnate over the last decade or so were probably astonished to read reports in newspapers that, in fact, the standard of living of Americans has risen greatly over that period and that the statistics were incorrect. In short, history has a deep impact on the way we think about the world, and because Canada and Latin America underwent a very different history, they have a very different way of thinking about the world than the United States. Latin America, for the most part, did not experience constantly rising standards of living. Latin America did not have the same experience of economic and territorial growth. Latin America did have an experience with conquest, but as we will see in our second session, it was an experience that was quite different than that in the United States. For residents of the United States, the quote-unquote legacy of conquest was a record of constant expansion, of breaking down every boundary, of clearing the land of Indians. But in Latin America, it was quite different. The legacy of conquest was the shattering of indigenous cultures. The legacy of conquest was the imposition of new cultural forms on Latin America. In other words, the legacy of conquest was quite different, and it has given rise to a different psychology, a different outlook, and different forms of art, music, literature, and philosophy. This class will show you precisely how those differences have played out. Our goal is to show you that things that you take for granted are really the result of long-term processes that are still underway, whose end is not yet in sight. The end of history is a long way away. The fifth and final theme of our course involves two fundamental processes that are reshaping the world that we live in right now. One process I will call globalization. Now, we've all heard about globalization. We've all heard about the emergence of new multinational corporations, but that's not all that globalization is. It's not just global communications. It's not just global manufacturing. It's not just global entertainment. Globalization also involves the expansion of processes that cut across national boundaries, like mass migration. Before 1965, almost all of America's immigrants came from Europe. But since 1965, they've truly come from the world over. The world is being changed by globalization, and we need an education that reflects this new internationalization. National boundaries don't mean the same thing that they did even a decade ago. But at the same time that the world is being globalized, it is also being segmented into smaller ethnic, racial, and religious groups. If globalization is one process that is transforming the world, a parallel process I will call particularization. That is the emergence or resurgence of older identities based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and religion. Now, we often hear complaints about the rise of identity politics in the United States, and there is deep fear in the United States that a core American identity is being eroded by the rise of tribal identities of various sorts. The most recent example was the loud public outcry over talk of Ebonics, which was an attempt to focus on difficulties that poor or African American students face in learning mainstream English in schools, because the English that they're exposed to in isolated ghetto regions is quite different, with a different and distinct vocabulary and grammar. But let me stress to you that ethnic and religious particularism is not confined to the United States. All around the world, the dual processes of globalization and particularization are taking place and transforming the entire world around us. Now, how is it that two seemingly contradictory forces can be working hand in hand at exactly the same time? Shouldn't globalization make us more homogeneous and unified? Shouldn't globalization sweep away all those particularistic identities? 150 years ago, Karl Marx predicted that the Industrial Revolution would sweep all national identities into the dustbin of history. But in fact, precisely the opposite happened. National identities grew more important even as the Industrial Revolution was underway. And it produced wars and conflicts culminating in World War II. Globalization, I would argue to you, creates deep discontents. Globalization makes people worried that the underpinnings of their culture are going to be destroyed, to be swept into the dustbin of history. But people do not react passively to that threat. People do not sit back. They take active steps to reassert their identity and their culture. But there's another reason why we have seen the growth of particularism in the world today. Individuals have learned a crucial lesson in the 20th century, that individually they may well be powerless, but in groups they are powerful. By affiliating together, by asserting their group identities, people have discovered that they are able to obtain rights and power that would otherwise be denied to them. In short, particularism provides a way to combat the disadvantages of globalization. And so in this class, we will look at both processes and see how they interact, how globalization and particularism work hand in hand. Now today, we are in the midst of a culture war not simply in the United States, but a culture war all around the globe. On one side are those who would hope to impose common cultures. On the other hand, there are those who want to maintain their particular and distinctive cultures intact. Throughout American history, those who have tried to impose a common culture have repeatedly, and in my view, for the best, failed. The best example of this effort to impose a common moral culture was prohibition. And the lesson of prohibition was simply that one cannot legislate morality. But the best features of our society, indeed the best features of the cultures of the Americas, I would argue, are a product of intermixture and especially the desire of outsiders to become insiders and to take their culture with them. Movies in the 20th century were largely the product of two outsider groups in the United States: Eastern European Jews and Southern Catholics, Southern European Catholics. Out of their own cultures, they created new cultures that have revolutionized the 20th century and made our world truly a better place to live in. In the world of the 21st century, new cultures, new groups of Asian, African, indigenous American, and Hispanic descent, all will be bringing new cultures into the mainstream, and they too will be creating a better world for everyone. I would argue that the fundamental dynamic of the United States' culture, the engine that makes our culture exciting and innovative, the engine that keeps us from becoming a tired, homogeneous society, the engine that changes America is the push of outsiders to become insiders. And the day that that process ends is the day that the dynamism of United States culture ends. Our goal in this course and in the new American Cultures program is to celebrate our differences, to celebrate our diversity, and try best way we can to promote discussion, to promote dialogue among people from different national, ethnic, religious, and racial backgrounds, and to try to create a cacophony of voices, all speaking to each other, not isolated
apart. In other words, the goal of our course and our program is what we believe should be the same goal of our society as a whole, to create a truly inclusive and pluralistic culture and to struggle to avoid the deep cleavages that are breaking the world apart elsewhere, in Canada, in Bosnia, in Rwanda. Today, the world, I believe, faces two paths. One path involves division. The other path involves respect for difference. We can go down the path of trying to create a homogeneous and totally unified society. But we've done better when we've been willing to tolerate the controlled anarchy and chaos of mixture, blending, and conflict. Now, in the remaining part of our class, I'm going to attack the notion that Europe in 1492 was more advanced than any other part of the world. In the next part of our class, I'm going to attack the notion that Europe was more civilized than, say, Africa or the New World. I'm going to attack the idea that Europe was more economically developed than other parts of the world. And to do this, I'm going to look at the three specific worlds that America grew out of. For the remainder of this session, I am going to give you the history of Europe, of Africa, and the New World up until 1492. This is, of course, an exercise in foolhardiness. You could take whole courses covering this subject. But I believe it is absolutely essential that we look at these histories in comparison. Because when we do, what we will see is that it is entirely misleading to assume that in the hierarchy of nations, the hierarchy of continents, somehow Europe was at the top. I'm going to demonstrate that Africa, the Americas, and Europe all had certain strengths, but they all had certain vulnerabilities. And the way history worked out was ultimately not preordained. It was not fated. It was not inevitable. It was the product of what I will call contingency. No one in 1400 would ever have guessed that Europe would be the dominant power in the world in 1900. Not a single person would have imagined that, least of all Europeans themselves. That it happened was not the result of accident, in the way we usually use that term. It was the result of contingency, of actions at every point in time, which could have worked out very differently under other circumstances. In short, we need to remember that the past was a blank sheet of paper in which only specific actions would lead to certain outcomes. History is not at all preordained, not then and not now. Now, before I give you the first 10,000 years of history before 1492. I do want to attack certain notions that many of us take for granted. I'm going to argue that the way that we define the concepts of civilization tend to be extremely, quote-unquote, Eurocentric. In other words, we claim that Europe was more developed, more advanced, and more progressive than other continents, but we use Europe as the very essence of our definition of what superiority is. And therefore, it becomes inevitable that Europe is superior. This is a sort of circular reasoning that needs to be refuted. And that is precisely what I want to do next. Let me, if I could have the overhead projector for just a moment, please. Okay. Now this is a picture of warfare. And most people, I think, would assume that Europeans were far superior in warfare to other people around the world. And it is true that the Europeans had gunpowder and guns and other well-developed methods of killing. The Chinese had actually invented gunpowder, but believe it or not, they had not used gunpowder in guns. That had not seemed like a logical way to use gunpowder. Instead, they used it in fireworks and rockets and the like. But the Europeans had a very specific notion of warfare. If we could have this picture back, you'll see them using dogs to subdue native peoples. The purpose of European warfare was to kill people. And the Europeans would even introduce an interesting technique into the New World to do this, one that we're all familiar with called scalping. Now, from endless numbers of John Wayne movies and the like, we have all been taught to believe that it was the Indians who scalped people. But in fact, the notion for scalping had been practiced in Europe before it was ever practiced in the Americas, and the Europeans often required Indians to scalp people in order to get certain payments from the European colonizers. In other words, scalping was a European invention. Now, by European standards, New World warfare was very inefficient. New World warfare was not aimed, usually, at destroying another people wholly. It was usually aimed at getting captives who would then be integrated into a larger political unit. Now, this didn't make any sense to the Europeans at the time. It often hasn't made sense to students even today. But it's a very different definition of warfare. A definition of warfare that is, I would say, Eurocentric. If we could have the screen show again, please. Our definitions of civilization, of government, of religion tend to be heavily Eurocentric. Now, what do I mean by that? By civilization, if you take an anthropology course, and I'm afraid that my partner, Katzil Castaneda, is not here today to be able to speak on this. The definition of civilization usually entails the growth of a state political apparatus, the growth of a class system, the development of monumental architecture, the development of a priesthood, and the development of large cities. Now, that definition of quote-unquote civilization fit Europe very well. And therefore, by circular reasoning, by a sort of peculiar process of logic, it showed that the European societies were, of course, advanced civilizations. And then these very definitions could be used to argue that other people were, quote-unquote, less civilized, a morally loaded term. But I'm going to try to demonstrate that those definitions are not the only definitions that one could use. And further, I'm going to demonstrate to you that no culture ever rose alone. All cultures rose as a result of intercultural interaction and the development of new cultures. But before I do, let me begin with a story of a man that you've all heard of, but a man that historians know surprisingly little about, but a man whose life illustrates more than any other the blending and mixture of cultures. And that is, of course, Christopher Columbus. We don't know for sure when he was born. We don't know for sure where he was born. There is still ongoing dispute about his nationality, and we don't even know where he's buried, though 6 different grave sites have been viewed. And despite many portraits of Columbus, we don't even know what he looked like because no portraits were drawn when he was still alive. Nevertheless, Columbus is certainly the most important person in the last 600 years. No, of course, he did not discover America. The verb is entirely wrong for our modern multicultural world. The word discover implies a us, a we, who went out and discovered a them, who were strange and unknown. It contrasts us with the other. But imagine how that makes you feel when you're the other. He was not, of course, even the first outsider to set foot in the Western Hemisphere. That distinction, of course, belongs to the first human settlers of the Americas who arrived between 20 and 70,000 years ago. And he wasn't even the first person other than the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas to arrive. There was a Buddhist from China who visited the New World in the 5th century, an Irish monk, a Welsh prince, and of course Leif Erikson, who arrived in Vinland in Canada around 1000 AD. So what makes Columbus matter when these earlier voyages did not? Columbus's voyage would totally transform both the New World and the Old World. New foods would reshape the diets of both hemispheres. Europeans would introduce Old World diseases to the New World, killing millions of indigenous peoples. And Columbus would initiate the Atlantic slave trade. Short, for better or for worse, Columbus totally transformed the world in a way that no one else in history has. Slavery, conquest, disease, ecological disruption, all of these were Columbus's legacy. But there was also a more positive legacy as well, the development of a new notion of human progress and the creation of new hybrid or Creole cultures that combined European, African, and indigenous American elements. Let me just digress briefly for 1 second and tell you about the invention of the idea of progress. Before Columbus, most Europeans believed that there were certain ideas, certain fundamental ideals that were timeless, that existed forever, that were innate to society. Among those ideas that they took for granted, for example, was slavery. But Columbus's voyage was shocking because the indigenous people that he encountered had very diverse ways of life that were fundamentally different from those that Europeans took for granted. In other words, European ideas could not be timeless and universal because they had been demonstrated to be historical constructions, cultural constructions by the native peoples of the Americas. And so, if they were not timeless, if they were not inherent, then they could be changed. And just 24 years after Columbus landed in the Caribbean, an English writer named Sir Thomas More wrote a book in Latin called Utopia. It was about an ideal society without poverty, without warfare, a place of true equality. And while the book was written in Latin, he located his perfect society in the Americas. It was the first time in modern history that Europeans were envisioning a new and perfect world fundamentally different from the world they had been exposed to before. Now, there was recently a cartoon in one of the newspapers about Christopher Columbus that I think sums up many contemporary attitudes towards him. It shows a picture, a sign in the front of Jack's department store. The sign reads, "Columbus Day Sale, all merchandise marked up 200%, because let's face it, Columbus was a greedy opportunist just like Jack." In fact, Columbus was a very complicated figure who one cannot talk about in simplistic terms. He probably never heard the name Columbus. His name was probably Cristoforo Colombo, but he was generally called by a Portuguese or Spanish version of that name, Cristobal Colon. He signed his name quite differently from either of those. I can't pronounce it, but it's a mixture of Greek and Latin. Like all heroes throughout history, all major figures from Julius Caesar onward, Columbus was never a real man. He's whatever people wanted to see. To the Renaissance, he was an open-minded explorer. To the American revolutionaries, he was a true founding father. Today, he's often perceived as the embodiment of every conceivable sin, spiritual, political, economic, and ecological. The real Columbus was a tall, red-faced man. He was probably born around 1451 in Genoa, in Italy, the son of a lowly wool weaver. His father, however, was quite ambitious for his son, and he sent his son away from Italy to Portugal, which was the leading European trading nation of the time. father wanted his son to get in on the ground floor of an expanding business, not plastics, the advice in The Graduate, but rather trade, international trade, which I suspect would not be bad advice even today to one's own children. And Columbus became involved in the most progressive portion of international trade, trade off the coast of Western Africa. Columbus married the daughter of a governor of a wealthy Portuguese island called Madeira, located just off the African coast. There, the Portuguese used thousands and thousands of African slaves to raise sugarcane. So as a young man growing up, Columbus became quite familiar and even knowledgeable with the use of Africans in forced labor, raising sugarcane in these islands off the coast of Western Africa. These islands had been uninhabited prior to the arrival of the Portuguese, except at one island where they exterminated the inhabitants. Now, Columbus was an ambitious man. He wanted to become rich. He wanted to enter the nobility. But he was also a deeply religious man, a man who truly wanted to save the world. And he didn't see any contradiction in these two aspirations. He was going to get rich, and he was also going to help spread Christian religion. Indeed, the reason he would tell Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain that he needed to travel across the ocean sea was to raise money. He would convert the unconverted to Christianity in Asia, and he would use the wealth that he uncovered to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. And in that way, he would usher in the second coming of Christ. No lowly aspirations for Christopher Columbus. But instead, in the New World, he brutalized and enslaved the people he encountered, and ultimately he was so cruel that Spain dragged him back in chains. So let me tell you the story of Columbus, a truly American story. He was 41, which in those days was quite an old man. His dream came true. He got the money he needed to travel across the ocean, and he reached the land he knew was there. But it wasn't the way he imagined. He couldn't find Japan. He couldn't find the gold mines that he was sure were there. But he was given more ships. He was given more men, and he would make 3 more voyages to the Caribbean. But something was wrong, and people became suspicious. He wasn't in China. He wasn't in Japan. And then the people that he was brutalizing, the people he forced to gather a certain amount of gold a month or have their arms chopped off, these people began to rebel. And things got out of hand. And Columbus is dragged back to Spain and imprisoned. He was going to get rich, and he was going to save the world, but something went wrong. Columbus truly was the first American.